The Australian Financial Review.
Over 20,000 babies are born in Australia every year with the help of IVF. And as pioneering doctors sell up and cash out of the industry, private equity firms are piling in. The latest play came just a few months ago, when Genesis Capital made an offer for Monash IVF. The bid was rejected, but if a deal is eventually done, the top 3 IVF players in Australia will all be private equity owned. These new investors, by their very nature, are chasing higher and higher returns. Competition is fierce, and add-on procedures such as egg freezing have become a key battleground.
You've got these commercial models where doctors are incentivised to sell more and more cycles and add-ons. So I think there are genuine concerns about the over-commercialisation of this industry.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, health editor Michael Smith on why baby making is big business and how private equity firms are reshaping the local IVF industry. It's Thursday, January 22. Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Mike, let's start at the beginning. What made you want to look into Australia's IVF industry and the growing number of private equity owners?
Yeah, Lisa, it started off with a series of conversations I was having with women I know and women I work with, and dozens of people were telling me they were just getting really bombarded with these quite aggressive ads on social media for egg freezing, and this was really prevalent for women in their 20s and 30s.
So I was 30 years old when I discovered my husband had been cheating on me for about a year.
And one woman said ads started filling her social media just as she was going through a divorce.
I began the divorce process pretty much immediately. So that's when I started being bombarded with ads for egg freezing.
She didn't even interact with these ads, but they kept coming.
Since then, it's been about 2 years and I literally still can't escape it.
So I started going in and having a look at some of these ads, and the headlines are things like freeze time, not dreams, stop the clock, and the sooner the better.
It's implying that I have no options or that my time is somehow up.
And at the same time, I'd been hearing a lot of stories about the IVF industry in general and what people were going through. And there seemed to be this general unease by a lot of women and parents I knew who were going through the system. They had some pretty stressful stories to tell, but the egg freezing stuff was what really stood out, and these ads are pretty relentless.
Okay.
And it looks like the marketing is having an impact.
When I came back to Australia from the UK after living there for 8 years, I really noticed among my friends this conversation around freezing your eggs was really prevalent, and much more so than in the UK. And it made me think, oh my God, do I need to be doing this?
So they're sort of almost guilting people into freezing their eggs, although there are, a lot of good reasons to do it. And this got me sort of thinking about the commercialisation of the IVF industry, where the costs are very high, people are spending a lot of money on these services. And I started looking into who owns all the clinics. This is really interesting. These clinics used to sort of all be run by pioneering doctors who founded Australia's first IVF clinics, but now they're all selling up and cashing out, and private equity firms are moving in. Mm-hmm. And this is happening all around the world, not just in Australia. And I cover healthcare, so just as I was sort of looking into this, last November, a Sydney-based private equity firm called Genesis Capital made this takeover offer of more than $300 million for Monash IVF, which is a big listed company on the Australian Securities Exchange. Mm-hmm. Now, Monash rejected that initial bid. They said it was sort of opportunistic. But if it does become successful eventually, which it could, it'll mean Australia's top 3 IVF groups, Monash IVF, Virtus Health and Genea, which collectively account for about 80% of the market or more, will all be private equity owned. And some people are becoming really concerned about whether private equity are actually the right owners of these IVF clinics.
So let's talk about that takeover offer, because Monash IVF, which, as you said, is listed on the ASX, it's been in the headlines over the past few years. There have been a series of operational failures that have had really devastating consequences for those involved. What's behind this deal, this offer, and why are private equity firms so keen on the IVF industry?
So patients are on average spending tens of thousands of dollars to have a baby through IVF. So this means private equity's really interested in this sector. There's a long-term trend for people to have babies when they're older, which means they're more likely to need assisted reproduction. And you've also got a lot more same-sex couples now having babies with the help of IVF. The industry is huge. In Australia, there's about 20,000 babies born each year following IVF treatment. I'm sure many of our listeners know someone who's had children born to IVF. Mm-hmm. And Monash IVF is really interesting. It's one of the biggest players in Australia. It's listed on the ASX, but it's had this scandal-plagued few years. And this is one reason why it's become a target, because its share price has become so low, it left it vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been 2 really bad embryo mix-ups at Monash IVF clinics over the last few years.
A Brisbane woman has been left devastated after unknowingly giving birth to a stranger's baby.
The first one was first revealed last April.
It is a shocking mix-up where the woman's fertility clinic implanted the wrong embryo.
The company was sort of forced to admit a patient at its Brisbane clinic unknowingly gave birth to somebody else's baby in early 2023. So this was pretty shocking. Headlines everywhere. It really made people have a good think about the industry. But then there was another one.
Monash IVF is in damage control today.
So in June last year,
admitting to its second embryo transfer bungle in 2 months.
It revealed one of its Melbourne clinics had mistakenly transferred a patient's own embryo instead of her partner's. So both mix-ups were pretty shocking.
The Federal Health Minister has blasted Monash IVF, demanding it come clean on its shocking fertility failures.
There was a lot of debate around it.
And I just don't buy the privacy argument that the company is coming up with.
They were eventually found to be due to human error. Reforms, have been introduced. There's still a lot more work to do. And many clinics now have electronic witnessing technology. They have a second person verifying sperm and egg at every step of the process. I've been into one of those clinics and it's very high-tech stuff. But these incidents have really put the industry's practices in the spotlight. People tell me there's probably a lot of other incidents that we'll never know about. So as a result, the then Monash CEO, Michael Knapp, he resigned in June last year.
Monash IVF announced its chief, Michael Knapp, was out.
The company's been a bit of a mess.
2 days after the company revealed it had incorrectly transferred the wrong embryo to a patient in Melbourne last week.
And in 2024, Monash agreed to settle a class action with more than 700 former patients.
The fertility group is accused of using inaccurate genetic testing and destroying potentially viable embryos.
And it had to pay out $56 million.
The class action claimed 35% of embryos found to be abnormal were actually false positives.
So as a result of all these mix-ups, not surprisingly, Monash's share price slumped. And that's why Genesis came in with this takeover offer at the end of last year. It was pretty opportunistic. They were taking advantage of Monash IVF's lower share price. It's had this reputational hit. But that offer was rejected by the board of Monash. However, investors are betting there's going to be a higher offer coming in at some stage, either from Genesis or perhaps another buyer.
What would that mean for the industry? Who are the biggest players and how profitable are they?
Yeah, the IVF industry in Australia used to be really fragmented, as I said before, run by a lot of individual doctors, but the entry of private equity has led to this sort of massive round of consolidation. So you now have 4 large providers accounting for about 80% of the Australian market. So the biggest one is a private equity firm called BGH. Then you have Monash IVF, and they're the 2 biggest operators nationally with a share of 37% and 31% respectively. They're followed by a company called Genea in third place, That was acquired by an Australian private equity firm called Liverpool Partners for $200 million in 2022. They have a 12% share. And then you have a few other players, including a Korean company called CHA Healthcare and Singapore Medical Group, which have also bought up some clinics. It's really hard to find out how profitable the sector is because these are private companies. A lot of the results are not disclosed. This financial year, Monash IVF reported a net profit of almost $26 million, but it told shareholders in November that new patient registrations and its market share was slipping, and that was partly to do with the reputational damage as well. The private equity-owned clinics, they don't release financial data, but I've spoken to a lot of people in the industry and they're saying the growth rates for IVF procedures are now around 2.5 to 3% annually, and egg freezing is a lot higher. Its growth is around 4 to 5%. So egg freezing has sort of become this investment in future patients for the clinics because they hope women will return to use their IVF services later in life when the eggs are thawed out.
So, Mike, what's the problem with private equity moving into the IVF industry? Because as you explained, the problems at Monash IVF happened without a private equity owner. Why does more private equity owners in the sector make people even more concerned about commercialisation?
So interestingly, a lot of people I spoke to for this story compare the industry to almost like gambling, where people are a bit desperate. They're really incentivized to keep paying up on the chance they might have success. And I think the concern here is that there's the potential scope for some operators to exploit that hope and this really emotional decision-making that comes with this. There's a bit of a concern, the private equity model is to cut costs and grow earnings as much as they can. But there's also this concern the IVF industry has just sort of grown too fast and the clinics can just not keep up. So I spoke to a lot of doctors, industry insiders, executives, former executives, and importantly, the patients. And they're telling me the embryologists and the other staff are under more pressure than ever. And this means mistakes can be easily made. And some people say that explains the mix-ups at Monash. And doctors are also paid per cycle of IVF, and the clinics are sort of incentivised to encourage patients to pay more for these quite expensive services called add-ons. And, these are all legal services. They're designed to increase the chances of having a healthy baby and to avoid any problems. So depending who you speak to, there's a lot of different opinions about add-ons.
So it's like private equity is making the sector more competitive, and this push to get more profits, it's just adding to that pressure.
That's right, and potentially trying to sell services to people when they might not actually need them. I interviewed Lynn Burmeister, so she's very interesting. She's one of the country's top IVF doctors. Now, Burmeister was actually the first prominent IVF doctor in Australia. She was dubbed Melbourne's fertility queen by the Women's Weekly in 2013. So she left Monash IVF quite controversially in March 2017. She set up her own fertility business called Number One Fertility. She's a very outspoken critic of private equity ownership. But you've got to remember, she does also have a vested interest now as she's also set up her own company. She owns a lot of clinics. So she told me a doctor can usually handle 100 egg collections a year, but the bigger private equity-owned clinics have these doctors doing up to 160 a year. So she argues this sort of deep cost-cutting and the focus on generating profits also comes at the expense of patients.
And as you say, she has been critical of private equity owners. How do the private equity players respond to this criticism?
Yeah, I also interviewed Ben Gray for the story. So he's sort of one of Australia's best-known deal makers. He worked at Credit Suisse and TPG for many years. He went on to start his own firm, BGH Capital, which invests in mid-sized companies in Australia. And one of those was Virtus Health, which BGH bought back in 2022 for about $700 million. Gray is all over this industry. It said it sort of consumed his life for many years, and he's sort of very defensive. He is adamant that while the IVF industry in Australia is fiercely competitive, private equity firms can actually be responsible owners of businesses and potentially make them better. So he argues that BGH is actually building better clinics, improving patient care, and they're attracting the best doctors by giving them a share in the company and the profits. So he's sort of abolished this non-compete clause and given his doctors more freedom. And interestingly, sort of Gray's walking the talk. He and his wife, Victorian Labor MP Luba Grigorovich, are actually expecting twin boys this year, and they were conceived through IVF at one of Gray's clinics. And he was sort of telling me about the process they went through, and he said they chose to have pre-implantation genetic testing. So this is a procedure which checks for genetics or chromosomal abnormalities before the embryo is implanted.
So it's one of those add-on procedures that people
absolutely.
are talking about.
And this is one of these many services clinics are providing, which has attracted criticism from some academics and doctors for sort of being unnecessary money-making procedures. But Gray says, in his own words, it was for our peace of mind because I know it leads to improved embryo selection and outcomes. So BGH has invested more than $100 million in these really fancy, world-class facilities in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And BGH has also been sort of poaching these so-called superstar doctors from rival firms. And at the top of the fertility tree are these doctors they have what is called a certificate in reproductive endocrinology and infertility, known as a CREI. To get these, it takes decades of study and training. There are only 80 of them on the east coast of Australia. Virtus claims to employ about half of them. Many of them are women. And the highest paid specialists can make as much as $2.5 million a year. But more generally, those with high volumes of patients can sort of make around $1 million. So Gray reckons the business that he bought was nearly broken when BGH moved in, but he's sort of arguing he's turned it around and he's got these sort of very happy doctors and patients now. But
well-paid doctors.
Very well paid. But the concern is really around the pressure on private equity players that they're always under to chase higher and higher returns, and whether this is coming at the expense of patients. From what I've seen, the marketing's working. Egg freezing's just going crazy in Australia, and the rates are much higher than in other countries. I looked at some data from 2023, which is the latest figures we have, and that showed there were nearly 9,000 cycles done in Australia in that year. And the UK, which has double our population, there was less than 7,000 cycles done. So there's absolutely no doubt that egg freezing is really on the rise in Australia.
We're talking about the IVF industry and the growing number of private equity owners. This isn't just happening in Australia, but around the globe as PE firms bet on more people looking to have babies at an older age and more same-sex couples having babies with the help of IVF. There's some concern that the search for new revenue streams has led to aggressive advertising for add-on procedures such as egg freezing. Mike, why is egg freezing on the rise in Australia, more so than in other countries, and why are people concerned?
Yeah, look, a lot of this has to do with commercial interests. So while regular IVF accounts for about 5% of babies in Australia, some clinics are now seeing a moderation in revenue growth. And they're saying this is partly because there's just better technology, so it means people need less cycles than before. But there's also been a bit of a drop-off in demand because of cost of living pressures in Australia, particularly in Victoria over the last year. So egg freezing is seen as this new frontier, really important new revenue stream. And with lifestyle choices and the demands of work, cost of living pressures, and we all know about high housing prices, so people are delaying the decision to start a family. And this means the demand for egg freezing is on the rise.
And roughly how many women return to use their eggs?
So global studies and a lot of experts put the figure at less than 11% or even lower. And of those who do return, only about 1/3 of those result in actual births.
Oh, right.
So Karen Hammenberg is a senior research fellow at Monash University. She spent 2 years as a clinical coordinator for Australia's first IVF programs, and she's particularly worried about how egg freezing is being promoted to young women. So she recently did a study of social media posts from 34 Australian and overseas online influencers who sort of documented their egg freezing experiences. Her Monash University study concludes the rules, quote, excessively emphasise the benefits but omit critical information about the downsides like the physical side effects and the cost, of course. And the study notes the growing prominence of paid partnerships between influencers and fertility clinics. Egg freezing's not as lucrative, though, as IVF is for clinics, but it's also the fastest growing revenue stream. You know, egg freezing can cost sort of $13,000 to $15,000, but you only do it once, whereas an IVF cycle, again, the costs range, but it could be $10,000 per cycle, and a lot of people have numerous cycles. I mean, I spoke to one patient who spent $80,000 in total to have a baby. So all up, it's a lot more lucrative. And you've now got sort of big corporates, including Google, Apple, Facebook, Goldman Sachs, Harrison AI. They're offering to subsidise egg freezing for their staff. So Burmeister, she's got strong views on this issue. She believes egg freezing's a really important part of the business. Her clinics in Melbourne have more than 20,000 eggs in storage alone. But she sort of alleges the pricing models at some clinics are not transparent. So, for example, she says a patient can be shown the price for freezing 10 eggs, which is the average per cycle. But if they produce 30 eggs, they're going to be charged to freeze all of them.
Okay.
So they might not be aware of that when they go into it. She says some clinics were pricing egg freezing at $15,000, but she sort of proudly says she came in and disrupted the market in 2017, and she was offering deals as low as $2,500.
So, Mike, these concerns are out there about add-on procedures and the high costs involved. We had the high-profile embryo mix-ups of the last few years. What regulations are in place and how could they be improved?
Yeah, and this is where it gets sort of quite complex and quite fraught. And this debate has really gathered steam since the Monash IVF mix-ups last year, and politicians are starting to take note. So I spoke to a woman called Petra Whale. So she's a clinical embryologist and she's the president of the Fertility Society of Australia and New Zealand. So that's kind of like the industry group. So she cautions against presenting this sector as being the Wild West. She says it's important to remember that our clinics are actually quite highly regulated, transparent, and they operate under what she calls ethical guidelines. And of course, patient consent is paramount to all this. So no one's sort of being forced to do anything they don't want to do. But she does say there needs to be a more coordinated approach to regulation across the country. You know, it sounds very messy. The IVF sector in Australia is governed by more than 40 laws across the states and territories. And the industry wants sort of a national law and the creation of a national donor register. In September, in the wake of the Monash incidents, there was a government review of the industry, and that agreed to change the way assisted reproductive technology services are accredited, and that'll start in 2027. But the industry is really divided. There's this body called the Reproductive Technology Accreditation Committee.
Okay.
And this is this body which sets the minimum standards for the industry. But the interesting thing is when adverse events like the Monash IVF embryo mix-ups are reported, they're reported to this body, which has the acronym RTAC.
Yeah.
But the body is under no obligation to make them public. And it doesn't even have to report the details to the health minister of the day. And this is because of the need to protect patient privacy. So there's sort of a disagreement over whether RTAC should report these adverse events. Regulators have to do this in the United Kingdom. and other people say, well, it's in the public interest to publish so-called near misses. But a lot of people I spoke to in the industry said the flip side is you'll threaten patient privacy, but also the clinicians will be incentivised not to report mistakes. They'll end up just not telling anyone, and that's sort of even worse.
So, Mike, a final question then, because even if the industry isn't the Wild West, if things go wrong, the consequences are just so devastating. Do you think private equity ownership is reshaping the IVF sector in Australia? And are the concerns about over-commercialisation of the sector warranted?
So the IVF industry's always been commercial, so we can't blame private equity for everything that's happening. But this is an industry evolving very quickly, and you've got all these new players swooping in, and the chase for higher returns is really increasing the pressure to cut costs, to generate more revenues. And this is what's concerning people here, where the profits are coming before the patients. So it certainly does add to this commercial pressure on what is a very sensitive industry. On one hand, IVF has enabled millions of people to have children when they couldn't have done it otherwise. Australia does have some of the highest standards in the world. One common theme that came up in my interviews was that a lot of this is patient-driven. Families, parents, women will do whatever it takes to have a child. But there's also this dark side of the industry, that some of these companies, it's just too easy to take advantage of women and families who are really desperate to have children. You've got these commercial models where doctors are incentivised to sell more and more cycles and add-ons. So I think there are genuine concerns about the over-commercialisation of this industry, and I think we need to see better safeguards in place, potentially more regulation to protect the interests of these patients, to ensure the industry is safe, and to avoid some of these terrible mix-ups that we've seen in the past.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review Health Editor Michael Smith joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin and Alex Gow. Fiona Buffini is Head of Premium Content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend as it helps others find us, and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.